Freedom of speech is something that's grossly misunderstood, not just by that of Marxists. If you have a listen to what Jason Unruhe goes on to say here.
Freedom of speech, it's a very difficult subject. It's far removed from the I defend your right to freedom of speech that we're used to hearing about. I believe it was Voltaire who said, I don't like what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it.
If Voltaire did say this, then Voltaire is right in what he stated. Freedom of speech is important, and even if you don't like what someone has to say, even if they say something that I completely disagree with, I'll defend their right to say it. The limitation is when it comes to threatening another person's life. In relation to individual rights, if you infringe upon another individual's rights, you should be punished for it. And rightly so. When it comes to threatening to take another person's life, then you should be investigated for that. When it comes down to that of hate speech or whatever it may be, in relation to do with racism or whatever it is, that individual has the right to speak their free mind. However, that does not mean to say that I agree with what they have to say, and this is something that many people grossly misunderstand. When it comes down to the victims, they have the choice whether they wish to believe that person or not, just as they have the choice whether to listen to them or not. You're not forced to watch my videos, and you're not forced to listen to my videos. You have the choice whether you choose to do so or not.
Because freedom of speech is much more complex than that. Everybody says, I believe in freedom of speech. But how many people really do? Take any person who says, I believe in freedom of speech, and ask them, okay, so do you want to invest in my child pornography business? And they'll say, whoa, I don't support that. But I thought you said you support free speech.
When it comes down to something like this question, hypothetically speaking of the child pornography business thing, it's just like that of threatening to take someone's life. This is very similar to do with that of anything to do with children, because children are not mature enough. Perpetrator is the one who would infringe upon the rights of an individual. It's child abuse. Action should be taken. They should rightly be investigated over things like that.
So somebody should be able to say what they want. Oh, well, I mean, there should be limits, of course, and in lies the problem. While just about everybody does believe in free speech, nobody really does believe in free speech. We all believe in limitations in some form or another. Anyone who holds this position that they defend all speech no matter what is either crazy or a liar.
I don't really think when it comes down to these specific people that they do support like all speech. I think what they're trying to say is they support all hate speech, etc, except for that to do with the death threats and whatnot, because then you're infringing upon others' rights. I think what they mean is to do with hate speech, such as to do with racism, etc. You know, what threat do they pose by speaking hateful things? I don't care what they say. I'll never agree with them. When people come out and say hateful things, let them. Let society regulate that for itself, as I say. Let employers, regulate that. But never put it in the hands of a regulator. Because here's the question. The likes of the government in charge to control and regulate over what hate speech is, they are the ones who get to define that. And what happens then is you open a can of worms where you blur the lines. I mean, all it takes then is for the regulators to then dictate what hate speech is and what is not. So how then do you determine what is hate speech? For example, I could come out and say, I support the privatization of the NHS. Many people might despise me for saying that. Does that then mean to say that this is classified as hate speech because they simply disagree with my point of view?
Now, let's look at another common situation. Someone's being racist, and somebody comes up and says, stop being intolerant. We're not going to tolerate intolerance. And that person turns around and says, you're being intolerant of my intolerance. You're a hypocrite. And then that person replies, you complaining about intolerance when you're being intolerant makes you a hypocrite. In actuality, both of them are being hypocrites, because it's far more complicated than that. And you end up in this really terrible paradox of trying to understand free speech and what constitutes free speech and what doesn't. Because in reality, speech is controlled and always should be controlled. There should always be limits.
You want to regulate that to do with hate speech and what is racist or not. Now, it's just like I said, when it comes down to people throwing around racist remarks, etc. Now they have the right to speak their free mind. I mean, never ever agree with what they say. They can say horrible things, I'll never agree with them on it, they have the right to say it. But when you put it down to this of a regulator, that of a government, to control and define what hate speech is. Now, we've already seen from the political correctness of the political left throwing around terms such as you're a Nazi, or you're a fascist, or you're a racist, you're a xenophobe, you're a homophobe. For what? For being white? For basically supporting Donald Trump? Because words have meaning. You can't just take a word like Nazi and call people these names without actually legitimacy. Just like you can't throw around the word racist without legitimacy. Now it's just like when people argued in favour of controlled immigration and leftists would shout, you're a racist. For what? For understanding the laws of supply and demand? For understanding that specific individuals pose a threat to people's lives, that there was terrorists coming to the country? When you give the regulator the power to define what racism is, it could easily blur the lines. You could end up finding people who are not Nazis, are not fascists, are not, of those political views, being put behind bars illegitimately simply because of the control over hate speech. Now there was a fine example of this, and all context was taken out of the matter. Count Dankula, where he came out and made a joke video. He was actually a former Marxist, believe it or not. He's now a libertarian, and he believes strongly in free speech. But there was something that he did, and it was basically a joke video of a Nazi pug. He got his dog to do, this whole Nazi salute, and yet there it was, in threat of being put behind bars. Now the court in Scotland took it out of context. They said context doesn't matter. Now where's the evidence to say that he's a Nazi? Where's the evidence to say that he supports fascism? There's no evidence whatsoever. Now if you take that out of context, if you give regulators the power to define what a fascist and a Nazi is, you can find many innocent people behind bars for absolutely no reason other than the fact that they made a joke. You could argue, well, such hate speech hurts, people's feelings. Well, if that's the case, then what if I come out and say that I support the privatization of the NHS? Now, I understand that in the eyes of you Marxists, you're so totalitarian, so far gone from reality, that you would turn and call anyone who supports privatization as a Nazi. So in other words, anybody who supports the freedom of the economy from government intervention, a free marketeer in other words, a supporter of capitalism, apparently we're all fascists. Because apparently in Nazi Germany they had privatization. So anyone, therefore, who supports privatisation must also be a Nazi. So Adolf Hitler drinks water and other people drink water, so we're all Nazis, we're all Adolf Hitlers. I mean, this is the logic behind the identity politics. It's irrational. In fact, it's downright stupid.
There is no this liberal idea of there just being free speech. To use an example, the Founding Fathers said, free speech, but they weren't very specific on that. Does that mean somebody could come in and argue that the British Crown should come back into the country? Well, they would probably say no. If a communist up in their time and said, you know what, we should probably completely overthrow all of the rich people and replace it with egalitarianism, they would certainly say, no, you're not allowed to say that.
Yeah, this is a complete misunderstanding of the American Constitution and their First Amendment right, and the American forefathers would never have supported such a thing to shut down, free speech. What they believe in is the ability for others to challenge those people with ideas. That's the reason why you see people like Caitlin Bennett, I think her name is, where she goes out and she questions people, and there's a few other, commentators and stuff like that I've enjoyed watching. These people would question communists even. I think another one is Charlie Kirk. I love his work, what he does, and he goes out and he actually challenges these people that he disagrees with on these college and university campuses. And that's what America's First Amendment right is all about. They can come out and say racist things for all we care. We don't care. Doesn't matter if challenging that of a Nazi, a fascist, you let them speak. Even if it's something that you think's just abhorrent, you let them speak. There's a fine line, a fine difference between death threats and that of people coming out and saying things that you don't like and you just simply don't agree with. I would never see eye to eye with that of Nazis and fascists. I would never agree with their points of view. But at the end of the day, they have a right to speak their free mind.
In our modern day, there's all kinds of speech that aren't allowed, hate speech, etc.
If I come out and say that I support getting rid of the NHS, is that hate speech? Because people emotionally are so attached to the NHS that if you dare to speak about getting rid of the so-called free things, is that hate speech? Just like that of Marcus Meekin that made a joke. Is all jokes now made as hate speech? What you're leading things down the road of is basically that to do with totalitarianism.
We shouldn't ever reduce it to simply being free speech. I believe in free speech. No, you don't. You believe in this. If we say, no, don't blame all Muslims for terrorism, and, we're going to censor you if you say something that insanely Islamophobic, they turn around and say, oh my God, you don't believe in freedom of speech.
I'll never ever, agree with anybody that comes out and say hateful things, because I don't believe everybody is the same. I believe people are individuals. Let the economy, let, businesses, let employers regulate that for themselves. If businesses wish to employ people who are racist, let them harm their own business reputation. That's the point of the free market, and they're not going to benefit from it because many consumers would not shop there. Let them speak whatever they want. If they wish to harm their own reputation as an individual, nobody's really going to employ them. It's the same thing with that of having friends. Who wants to be friends with that of people who are racist? Or they may have, for whatever reason being, they may have certain individuals who are friends with them or whatever. It doesn't mean to say you're forced to, communicate with those people. And again, it goes down that road of opening up the can of worms. Just because you find someone offensive, it doesn't mean to say they're racist. If you find me offensive, if you find what I've stated offensive, then go elsewhere. Nobody forces you to watch my channel. Nobody forces you to watch my videos or listen to what I have to say.
What we should do is come up with a definition of what speech should be free and what speech should not be free.
Oh great, who's the one that's going to regulate then? When you come up with a definition over what hate speech is, so what if it's going to be a political leftist who gets to determine what hate speech is? I mean, Christ, we've already seen that you hate anybody who comes out and says that there's only two genders, etc., male and female. What are you going to do to people who disagree then? Are you going to do it to them who say there's only male and female? Are you going to come out and say, right, you should go to jail for that because you don't agree with my views? You're saying things that are offensive. Sadly, this is what's happening today, and it's all because of you totalitarians.
Because there's no one who really believes in this ultimate freedom of speech, because it just doesn't exist.
You see, this is what splits a libertarian who supports capitalism from that of a socialist. I'm willing to hear their argument. I'm not going to be hateful towards them. I'll allow them to speak their free mind. I might agree or disagree with them. I would like to hear their own argument. So anyway, let's move on to the comments. Anonymous user goes on to say, well, I do have to give it to Vicky. She actually tries to explain why capitalism is inefficient rather than just going on about the theories of exploitation, which doesn't actually prove that capitalism doesn't work. It's just a moral justification for repressing any proponents of capitalism. She failed in her video, but is still better than socialists who go exploitation re. Also, you're right, neoliberalism is just a slur towards free marketeers and a straw man by socialists. So I completely agree, anonymous user. At the end of the day, she does try to at least make an argument for her case, and I can respect her for that. You'll find a lot of the socialists that I'll argue with, come out and name call using the ad hominem attacks, or they try and swerve around the topic issue or whatever. She's actually, trying to make such an argument on topic, but she just doesn't understand capitalism and the free market. In terms of the whole thing to do with neoliberalism, it's this word that's been thrown around so often. It's grossly misunderstood of what capitalism is, and anytime you listen to them trying to describe what neoliberalism is, it's just a word that they invented. Of course, they always speak about corporatism and they think that this is what capitalism is. It's always this thing. It's just like the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher. They tried to call this a period of neoliberalism, and somehow we're moving towards this free market, and I'm thinking to myself, what are you even going on about? We're not even remotely anywhere near close to being that of a free market. It was the same thing in the argument of the banking crisis. They said deregulation caused the banking crisis, and you're thinking to yourself, what are you talking about? There was no deregulation of the banks. Banks were overregulated both in the United States of America and Great Britain. It doesn't make rational sense. Minarchist Ball says, funny how the Soviet Union actually produced more food than Britain, not due to socialism but mainly because the USSR had a shit ton of land. But since they couldn't allocate the food efficiently, most of their population was starving. Britain actually produced less food than the USSR, but Britain was able to allocate food more efficiently, and thus Britain was thriving and the USSR was starving. This just shows how efficient the free market actually is. Well, first and foremost, Britain was never really free market. The difference with Great Britain was Britain had the partial bit of what a free market's about in terms of prices being left be to be regulated freely by the market itself. Under the nationalisation and whatnot, we would face food shortages and whatnot, but it's because of socialism of such inefficiency, because of the economic calculation problem. And that's the very reason why you were seeing such a high GDP, but much of what they were producing was going to waste. It wasn't meeting the demands of the consumer, misallocation of resources, etc. It's all in relation to do with prices. Entertainment Garrett says, I like how all these commies keep debating you in the comments section like they're just giving you views and comments. Lol. Keep arguing, commies. I don't really mind that they make their arguments and comment and whatnot. I'm always welcome to them, commenting and making their arguments and whatever. I'm more than happy, and it's not just a case of this, the views and whatever. The problem that you will always find with them is they don't really make any sound logical arguments, and even if they attempt to make such an argument, it's always these baseless claims. The type of arguments, and I had one recently, and it was a critic that says, I don't understand socialism, and I don't understand collectivism, or I don't understand, economics. What's that? That's not an argument. It's a baseless claim. It's saying, you don't understand this, and you don't understand that, but where's the evidence? And you see, that's what I mean in terms of the arguments that I come across. They're not really arguments, they're just baseless claims. PB goes on to mention anarcho-socialism will eventually turn into anarcho-capitalism, because if there's no state, there's nothing that controls and stops people from owning private businesses. And when private businesses are allowed, then the worker co-ops will simply go out of business because the private businesses are more efficient, and that's simply because of the law of supply and demand. I think this is one of the things that I would personally slightly disagree on, PB. The thing that I do agree with you on, however, the issue of the destruction, capitalism would be more efficient, and therefore you would find most of these workers' co-ops would go out of business. A part I would disagree on is that not all co-ops would be inefficient. In fact, if they were running under a market system, some of the workers' co-ops would be efficient, and there's nothing wrong with that. They would be operating under a capitalist system. That's not to say that in a free market that all businesses are guaranteed success, and it's the same thing with workers' co-ops. Not all of them would be guaranteed success, and that's part and parcel of a capitalist system. The thing that I would disagree on, however, and it's to do with history, you look at the Paris Commune, you look at Chaz just recently, you look at the anarchist Catalonia, which never was anarchist. When it goes in an example like, take Catalonia, the government immediately was destroyed. However, immediately after that, a committee formed, and they started forming a terror group that was terrorising others into the regime. They tried to regulate others, and this is what happens. It resorts to terrorism. So in this instance, it wouldn't just be a case that private businesses would take over and it would lead to anarcho-capitalism. Instead, it would quickly transform into its own form of government called committees. Now, they like to pretend that, of course, these committees are not governments. Junaid Hussain goes on to say, hi Scotty, great video as always. I wish you were our future Prime Minister. Anyway, I was going to ask what you would do with the BBC. Many people are getting fed up with forcing to pay the licence fee for over £150 to watch left-wing bias. I know that other parts of the world, the BBC is funded through advertising and subscription fees. Well, I've argued numerous times before. At the end of the day, I would say that the BBC needs to be completely privatised, and we need to move towards a free market. They should all be forced into competing with one another. That's the purpose of competition. Other Netflix type businesses stepping in and saying, well, if you're doing this wrong, then we'll step in and provide better. That's the purpose of the free market. The likes of the BBC, they've gotten away with this because for so long they've been guaranteed this money or whatever, been guaranteed such a position, and they've abused it. Democratic Utilitarian, a critic, says, what will prevent the private security firms from uniting with the private military and the private courts and form a state in your libertopia? The problem in this argument, and I provided in a video to do with private security, and it's all to do with the fact that the free market is driven by that of consumers. They are solely dependent upon the consumers for where they get their wage. So if they do not provide for the consumers, they're not going to get their wage. So it's not a case that they can just go against the consumers. For example, private security firms, from this argument, it's basically saying, well, they could just ignore the consumers and then collude together and somehow they would work together to go against the people. Well, it just isn't the case because they're dependent upon the people for that money. The state is not the one that's in control of the economy in a free market. In fact, the private courts are in defence of the individual's rights. At the end of the day, they can't just form together with the private military and then all of a sudden it's just all against them to form this, state over the top of everybody else. Anyway, folk, I've been on long enough. I hope it's been educational enough for yourself. If you've got anything you would like to add yourself, maybe it's something that I don't know of to do with the freedom of speech, comment in the comment section below and I'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you for watching. I shall talk to you later. Cheers.